What can we know about the person inside dementia? In a moment, we will look at the functional chart of a person with dementia so that we can have a better understanding of the process itself. But in order to do that, let's first take a side trip and look at something else charted in a similar way. Let's suppose that you decided to buy a blender, and you know that there are lots of different blenders on the market, and before you make your choice, and hopefully a wise one, you'll want to compare the various functions that a blender can have. It's the functions that matter the most. It's what the blender can do that you're interested in, not what its shape is or what its size is, but in its functions. So, interested in making a wise investment, you make a list of all the possible functions that a blender may serve. It may chop, it may stir, it may blend, it may whip, it may liquefy, it may grate, it may shred, it may mince, and it may do other things as well. So we have to look at all of those different functions in order to decide which are the most important to us and which each type of blender can do well. Notice that on this chart, if all the blenders performed equally well, they would all end up with marks right along the red line in the middle of this chart. But of course, not every blender works equally the same way. So let's look at some possibilities. One thing that you know about yourself is that when you use your blender, you almost always blend, and you very rarely shred with it. So those are two functions that you know you'll be most interested in. Number one is how well does it blend? And number two, how well does it shred? The one being much more important than the other. And so you discover that with one particular blender, it scores very, very high on the blending list and really pretty low on the shredding list. But that doesn't bother you much because you don't shred all that much. So, all things being equal, this particular blender might be a good choice for you. Now let's look at a similar chart that has to do with the human brain and the functions that the brain serves, which are not chopping, stirring, blending, and whipping, but other things. Let's look at that chart. And just as with the blender chart, you can see here that we will look at perhaps 10 different functions of the brain, and we're reminded that if a particular brain is average in every way, it would score right along the red line in the middle there. It would be equally as good as any other brain in each of the areas. However, we know that not every brain is equally good at every function. So we will notice as we look at somebody's brain that it scores at different points along this chart. Now, some of the brain functions that are measured on the tests that are used to measure in a neuropsychological battery of tests are functions like verbal memory, which is how well do you remember words? Visual memory, how well do you remember what you see? Attention, how well can you focus on the one thing that you're being asked to focus on? Language, how well do you speak or how well do you write? And then a number of other functions as well. And as we can see on this chart, this particular brain had a strength in verbal memory, scored higher than just about any other skill. It had a relative weakness in visual memory. It had a fairly strong ability in whatever is measured by number 3. It had just about an average ability in attention, and in language its score was really relatively low. So that was a weakness for this brain. And if we drew lines between each of the points, from the high to the low to the high to the lower to the lowest, you can see it makes kind of like a chart of a mountain range. And you want to remember that this is how just one brain scored in each of these 10 areas when compared to all the other brains that have ever been tested. So now let's look at what one of those neuropsychological batteries looks like when it is charted out. As you can see here, 8 different functions were measured on this set of assessments. The numbers at the top, the 3 on verbal memory and the 2 on attention and the 4 on language, are simply indicators that on those particular skills, 3 different types of tests were used for each one, so that the battery administrator can be fairly certain of the score in each area. Looking at those areas of function again, let's remember verbal memory simply has to do with how well you remember the words that are said to you. Visual memory is how well you remember what you see. Remote memory has to do with how well you remember things after a specific period of time. Attention has to do with how well you are able to focus on something that you should be paying attention to. Language has to do with how well you speak or write language. Visual spatial abilities has to do with things that have to do with how objects relate in space. It also gets into things like geometry and some of the higher order math functions. Executive skills measures the problem-solving part of your brain, the part of your brain that decides what am I going to pay attention to first and what do I need to do first in order to accomplish a more complicated goal. And finally, psychomotor speed simply has to do with how well this particular brain moves in carrying out various functions and the speed or rapidity at which it can do those things. Remember again that the brain that's average in each one of those areas when compared to all the brains in the world would score right across the page where the green line is. But of course, nobody is average in everything. By far, the majority of people score somewhere in that yellow band, either 1 or 2 standard deviations above or below that very green average, which would be right across the screen where the 0 is. So this is what a normal brain looks like, is a brain scoring in any or all of those areas within the yellow band. But as you can see here, whoever scored this brain found some scores that were very extreme. And as it turns out, this is a neuropsychological assessment battery for a person with dementia. Now, not every dementia affects the brain in the same ways, but this is not at all atypical, so it might be worth looking at. In this case, this person was really, really good, like off the charts good, like genius level in verbal memory. On the other hand, this person had almost no visual memory. This person might meet you in one room at a conference, go into the hall to go to the bathroom, and meet you again in the next room and not recognize you. This person is basically average in their ability, a little above average, to remember things over a specified period of time. It's usually about 5 minutes on these tests. They're very poor at maintaining attention on the task they're supposed to be paying attention to. And as they were very good in verbal memory, they're also near genius level in the use of language. This person speaks well and writes well, maybe a writer, maybe a public speaker, any of those kinds of careers. And then on the other hand, this person has almost no visual spatial abilities. In the area of math, that means they probably don't keep their checkbooks very well. This person has a relative strength, not an extremely high strength, in executive skills, manages to plan and manage his time in order to accomplish goals comparatively well. And then this person is very, very bad at psychomotor speed. They're very slow at trying to accomplish things that take moving around in space. So that overall is what the neuropsychological assessment battery results for a person with dementia may look like. Again, this is a very jagged chart. There are extreme highs and extreme lows, which means this person's experience of the world is not at all like the experience of the world of a person who scores around average in all of those abilities. Now, we're looking again at brain function. We're looking at what the things the brain is supposed to do. But consider what a chart like this might look like when you're considering a function other than brain function. A chart like that, if it described not thinking but running, might be the experience of running that a person with one leg as long as, say, Wilt Chamberlain's and the other cut off at the thigh might be. Does not make a particularly good runner. So that's a kind of a lopsided life to live if you're a runner. So let's go back to thinking again rather than running. The function, these are not bullet holes in the physiological brain. They're holes in the brain's ability to do what it's supposed to do, to think in this way or any of those 8 ways that we measured. So you can see that the whole person is still there, probably has the same hopes and dreams and interests in the world that they always did before. The person is still there. It's just that some abilities are now gone. So it's really important to keep in mind when you meet a person with dementia that the person is still there. You need to interact with the person and not with what you perceive to be the limitations that the person has.